What should everyone know about the U.S. Department of Labor's new rule increasing the minimum salary level for exempt employees? In this video, I'll break it down, including what's happening, who it applies to, and who it doesn't, and what to expect, including timing. So to start, this applies to the U.S. only, so employees working within the U.S., but there's certain things that all employees and managers should know. Now, I've been an employment lawyer and HR leader, and so I try to break down these concepts that can be really complex, or these rules that are hundreds of pages, and try to make them more simple. So in the US, let's start with the presumption that the US Department of Labor does that every employee should be paid overtime if they work more than 40 hours in a week. This is under a law called the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which has been in effect for almost 100 years. But in this rule, or in this law, it says that all employees should have these protections unless they're exempt if they're in a bona fide capacity, meaning if you're an executive, professional, administrator, outside salesperson, so they have some exceptions, meaning that these overtime protections do not apply to you. Well, this is what the law says, but there's an agency, which is the U.S. Department of Labor, that gets to give certain details about it. Basically, Congress sets, a few sentences effectively, and this agency puts out hundreds of pages and decides kind of more of the details about it. Well, the U.S. Department of Labor, in deciding who would, meet these categories and be exempt, came up with a few tests. And over the years, they've varied, but you can think about it pretty simply. That to be exempt and not have overtime laws apply to you, it has to depend on what you do. So this professional category, for example. Professional doesn't just mean like you put a suit and tie on and go to an office. They have specific categories, like a learned professional. This is like if you go to school for something and study, like a scientist, things like that. Or a creative professional. And this is like a singer, an artist, things like that it applies to. Also, certain professionals are lawyers, doctors, and teachers. They have a special exemption that I'll talk about in just a second. So those are some of the specific examples of professionals. There's administrative, which can be kind of the functions of running a business, but you have to be making decisions with like independent judgment and discretion. And so a lot of disputes and lawsuits you've seen about whether someone should or should not get overtime often is in that administrative exemption, because it can be a kind of a tricky one for even HR or employment lawyers to tell you what it is. There's also the outside salesperson that I mentioned, which is if your job is like outside of the office making sales. Think of it as like the traveling salesman, which in this day and time, a lot of times people are doing things by Zoom. And so outside salesperson, that definition really still is like from 100 years ago and thinks about, Willy Loman, if you get the reference. If you don't, Google it, great book and play. Anyway, it's people that are going out making sales. Now, some of these tests are what you do, and that's a huge part of this test. An executive is like if you're a manager and your job is management, not just like your title is manager, but you are managing a team of people and directing them what to do. And so there's a lot of definitions about what you do. But also the Department of Labor had tests that say you have to be paid on a salaried basis. So you have to have a guaranteed amount of pay. They often talk about it by week. And you can think about it like an annual type salary. And you have to be paid that, and it has to meet a certain level. So over the years, over time, those levels have been increased. Right now, in the US, the current salary level is $35,600, roughly, for most exempt employees. Now, earlier, if you remember, I talked about doctors, lawyers, teachers. Well, the three of those, and also outside salespersons that are paid on like a commission basis, that salary level does not apply. And personally, rarely will I give a lot of personal opinions on this, but like doctors, lawyers, like, okay, let's assume they're making more than that. But the teacher exemption is one that I don't always know the origins of why it was exempted, but that is one, including in the rule we're talking about. They got a ton of comments of people that are saying teachers, shouldn't be treated the same as doctors and lawyers. They should be eligible for overtime based on their historical pay levels. But that's unchanged, so I'll stop my personal opinion. And teachers, lawyers, doctors, and also outside salespersons, this does not apply. And that's like teachers, like certain people in a school, like a janitorial staff, or like a purely like professional administrator wouldn't be considered a teacher. But anyway, that's a question I got, so I wanted to include that. But so for these different other categories of professionals, administrative workers, things like that, executive, then it's that minimum salary. So right now the issue is the level that that salary will increase to. So in a video last week, and I was on vacation, so it was a little hard to hear, but there's, right now it's around 35,600, and I talked about that was put into place. It was ordered in 2019, but in 2016, there had been efforts to actually have it like 47,000 and above, but that had been struck down at the last minute, right before it was supposed to take effect, literally days. In the judge's decision in that, a judge in Texas had said a number of things, but that in part, that salary level was so high that it made the salary almost more important than what the employee does. And so that got struck down. And so there's basically a compromise under President Trump's Department of Labor. So that's how we got to that current 35,600 level. Well, last week, the Department of Labor, after a long discussion and getting public comments on this, they issued their rule. And so it does a few things. It would increase minimum salaries from that 35,600 level to about 44,000. And that would take effect July 1st of this year. And then in January 1st, it would go up even more to about 59,000. And so those levels, again, would apply to a ton of employees. It also would increase what's called a highly compensated employee. And so what this means is for somebody that may not, they may or may not, but satisfy all of the job duties of one of the exemptions, if someone is paid a really high amount, which is actually 85th percentile of like the government statistics for the average wage, if you're paid that much, then basically they're assuming, hey, you can negotiate your hours worked, and so you don't need all the overtime protections that other employees do. That's kind of the mindset where that comes from. So that level, that had been 100,000 for a long time. It went up to about 107,000. It's going to go up to like 132,000. I have my notes here. But it's going to go up above 130,000. And so that's going to go up as well. So you'll have to make at least that amount to be under highly compensated, which means that your employer just has to show you meet one of the duties to be exempt. So it's a lot easier to meet that. But you do have to still be paid on a salary basis, and that's important. Because last year, the Supreme Court heard a case about a company in Helix Energy that had an oil supervisor who was paid over $200,000 a year. So you'd think like highly compensated, but he was paid on a daily rate basis. So on days he worked, not an annual salary basis. And so for that reason, the court found that he was entitled to overtime pay. And there's an interesting dissent, which means like I disagree, by Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Samuel Alito. That was in that I'll talk about at the very end here. That could be notable. So right now you have these, and a lot of people are like, great, my pay is going to go up. But the challenge is just like 2016, we're in an interesting time. It's an election year, so this is President Biden's Department of Labor. So this is supposed to take effect July 1st. I expect a lawsuit to be filed any day. I checked just before I filmed this. It hasn't been filed yet that I saw, but a lawsuit. And so what you could see is what happened in 2016, that a court decision again says, hey, this cannot take effect, so we're going to hold off on this until the court decides. And so if that happens, that means a lot of companies are probably going to be doing Excel spreadsheets, trying to map this out. And so you kind of have to plan in case this happens, but also know that it might not. And so for employees, it can be hard to think like, okay, is my salary going to go up or not? And that's why you'll have to see kind of what happens. And with these court decisions, especially with that July 1st date, it's probably going to be very close to that date, like very end of June, that you really know whether there's going to be what's called an injunction, meaning like, hey, this is going to hold off on taking effect. And then it can depend on what happens in the election. So a lot of the arguments in the legal filings, I imagine, will be very similar to 2016, to say, hey, the agency doesn't have this. And I talked about Justice Kavanaugh's dissent in a Supreme Court case last year. Well, in that, at the very end, he said, basically, hey, overall, I'm not sure whether this highly compensated salary test really jives with the original FLSA, even though this has been in effect for 100 years, because it only talks about like a bona fide capacity. Like we should really just be focusing on what people do. And so he kind of hinted that Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Alito agreed. And so I think it's pretty foreseeable, in my opinion, that Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Alito would strike this down and think maybe there should not be a salary test whatsoever. So right now, that's why what's happening with the courts, remains to be seen. But for employees, even though it said final rule, it's really not final. And a lot of companies are going to be having to do a lot of work in case it happens. But also, don't be surprised if you get a memo at the last second of, hey, your pay may not be going up.